following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall. I am your host every week for this Talk Gab Fest, and some weeks we spice things up a little bit with a co-host, a dear friend named Gabriel Schecter, who shares my passion for baseball and literature and all kinds of good things in life. So, Gabe, you're here this morning, and how are you doing?
I am doing fine. It's beautiful here in Oregon, and tomorrow is the second anniversary of the day I arrived back in Oregon to live 2 years ago.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, this is a big week for me.
Well, happy anniversary, and and I guess it must, if my memory's right, it must not have been very long after that you reached out to me and we met in person for the first time.
Yeah, I think a couple of months after that I got out to the coast.
Okay, but enough about us. You brought along a guest, and I had a chance to spend just a couple of minutes chatting with him before we hit the record button. So I'm going to let you introduce him, tell us about him, and kind of let you take the lead in getting the conversation rolling. Take it away.
Thank you, Claire. I can't remember exactly when I met Charlie Vascellero. It was probably maybe 8 or 10 years ago in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame.
I feel like it was longer, Gabe.
When did you start working in the library there? I started working there in 2002 at the end of the year. So yeah, we might have known each other 15 or 18 years.
Yeah,
it seems like forever.
Yeah.
It seems like forever. Anyway, Charlie has become one of my favorite baseball people. He's what I was when I was younger, a sort of baseball vagabond who just gets around to different baseball places with some frequency, all of them cool and interesting, and made more so by his presence. Charlie is one of those people who knows how to live and brings the good times with him. Charlie, I want to start with the one thing that you and I have bonded over in Cooperstown while I was still there was Emmett Ashford. So why don't you tell us how you got involved with his story?
Yeah, well, for anybody who's not sure who Emmett Ashford is, I'll explain. Emmett Ashford was the first African-American umpire in Major League Baseball history. And that's an event that took place in 1967, which was a full 20 years after Jackie Robinson became the first African-American player in baseball history, which tells you something right there. It took another whole generation. Baseball was willing to accept an African-American player in 1947, however reluctantly, but they weren't ready to put someone in a position of authority for another generation, a person of color in a position of authority for another full generation. And Ashford had a unique way of dealing with it, and deal with it he did, because there were plenty of players who didn't like the idea of having an African-American man decide whether a pitch was a ball or a strike when they were at the plate, and they let him know so in no uncertain terms. And he rolled with it. He was a entertainer. He was a affable, lovable, likable guy who always had a smile on his face and brought an air of theatrics to the role of umpire. He really got into the calls, jumped up in the air.
Yes, he did.
Ran down the line and, was very animated in what he did. And that's how he dealt with the adversity and the prejudice, was to he laughed back in their faces when they did that to him. And my meeting of Emmett Ashford, I didn't get to know Emmett Ashford until he was dead. I mean, I knew who he was, but I was wandering around in the cemetery in Cooperstown, as I sometimes do, and Tim Wiles, an old acquaintance of ours who was the research librarian at the Hall of Fame, caught me wandering in the cemetery one time. I was taking care of another guy's grave, I have a couple of friends in Cooperstown who I only met after they died, and one of them was Harry Skillman, who I attended his funeral with Tim Wiles. And Tim Wiles intercepted me at the library one day, and I was about to go in for a rededication of Jackie Robinson's plaque ceremony, of all things. And as I was walking in the library, here comes Tim Wiles out of the library, and he's wearing his Casey at the Bat costume, which you're well familiar with. And I said, he said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going in the hall." And he said, "No, come with me. This is better." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Just follow me." And Pete, the mortician, drives up in a hearse right on the circle behind the library, the traffic, the little, you know what I'm talking about, where the Fenimore Cooper statue is. And so he says, get in with Pete. So I just jump in the passenger seat of the hearse, and I know Pete. He was a friend of mine and a guy I would see at happy hour after the work day was done plenty of times in Cooperstown, and spent a lot of time talking with him. So I jumped in his car, and I said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Who's that?" There was a coffin in the back, and he goes, "Oh, it's Harry Skillman. We're taking care of some of his last requests." He says to me, "He was a guy like you." I said, "What's his story?" He goes, Pete said, "He was a guy like you. He came to visit Cooperstown frequently and loved it here, loved it so much that he bought a plot in the cemetery, and he had a list of last requests that he wanted us to honor, and this is part of it. He wanted me to drive him a lap around the hall in the hearse, and he wants Tim to sing 'Take Me Out to the Ball Game' when we drop him in his grave here." And not just Tim and 12 relative strangers. There was only 2 pallbearers who actually knew Harry Skillman that day, and the rest of us were all just recruited for the funeral. And so
wow.
He's got a great headstone. It says, it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game on the front of the headstone. And then it says, "Been there, done that, but never this before. Speak to me. The silence is deafening." so after attending his funeral back in 2007 or 8, whatever it was, I just made it a regular occurrence. Every time I came into town, it's actually the first thing I do when I drive from Baltimore and I arrive in Cooperstown. The first thing I do is go to Harry Skillman's grave and tell him what's happened since the last time I was in town, because he has that on his headstone as a request. So I just kind of have a beer, whiskey, other things, and hang around with Harry for a little while. And I was doing that a couple of years ago, and I posted a photograph of it on Facebook, and Tim saw it. Tim, from wherever he was. I think he was at the library in Albany, and he said, "You know, Charlie, Emmett Ashford is buried just about 50 paces off to the left there." And I didn't know that. So I went and took the walk and found his grave, and it's on the far end of the cemetery, as you might know when you're entering. He's buried next to Ken Smith, one of the old directors of the Baseball Hall of Fame as well. And his grave was in horrible condition. There were truffles and mushrooms growing out of it, and it was all molded over and moss growing on it. You could barely read it. And flat headstone, laying flat. And when I got a look at it, I said, somebody's got to clean this thing up. And I got a hold of the caretaker over there. His name's escaping me right now, Bill Truax. Just remembered it. So I got a hold of him, and he power washed it for me. And cost me $50, but I thought it was money well spent to fix Emmett Ashford's gravesite. And then I created a little shrine in a shadow box, a plastic box. I put photographs of Emmett Ashford and other significant African-American firsts in Major League history: Jackie Robinson, Frank Robinson, Bill White. Yeah. What was the guy who was the GM of the Braves? First African-American GM
Bill
of the
Lucas.
Braves. Bill Lucas, Bill White. So I put all their pictures in there and a Bill White National League ball. And just to explain who Emmett Ashford was to visitors, if they come to the site, I air sealed it as best I could. And, you know, the weather up in Cooperstown's not so great. In the winter, the thing got completely buried in snow. But I did use some of that X2000 glue to seal it, or whatever they call that stuff. And
it clouded up that first winter, I remember.
Got a little condensation
clouded
in there.
up.
Yeah. And so, but I still tried to keep the gravesite in order, and some acknowledgement of who he was on the gravesite. His daughter is Adrienne Breton. She wrote a book about him. She lives out in California, and she's always thanking me every time I post a picture of the site and showing that it's clean. She appreciates. She's on the other side of the whole country. You know what's in there?
Can I jump in a second and just
jump in?
Explain how it came to be there. Emmett Ashford died, I think, in 1985, roughly. And sometime after that, a package arrived at the Hall of Fame sent by Ashford's widow, and it contained his ashes, which he wanted donated and something done with at the Hall of Fame. He donated the ashes to the Hall of Fame. He loved Cooperstown and the idea of the Hall of Fame that much. And they stayed there for a long time. Nobody knew what to do with them. You weren't going to put them on display. And why don't you pick up the story there, Charlie?
Well, I have a theory about this, and I think, you said they didn't want to put them on display. I think that was his intention, or his widow's intention, to put that urn in a display case or shadow box somewhere in the Hall of Fame and say, here are the ashes of Emmett Ashford, first African-American umpire in the history of Major League Baseball. And I think that was what they thought. This is all speculation on my part, but I cannot think of any other reason why you would mail the urn to the president of the Hall of Fame. I know it sat on his desk for quite some time before they bought the plot in the cemetery. And that when they did buy that plot in the cemetery, they went and bought a few more, like 6 or 8 plots. That's a vacant part of the cemetery. They're waiting for other special cases, I guess.
Indeed.
I know, that are going to be placed there at some point. But this was the precedent setter. This was the one that got those wheels in motion.
That's weird, huh?
I like going back and visiting with Emmett and Harry every time I'm in town, and I bookend my stays. Whether I'm in town for a week or a day or a month, I always start and finish my trip at the cemetery saying hello and goodbye to those two fellas.
Yep, I've joined you there a couple of times.
Yep. And we've got a little bit of a group. Greg Klein at the Cooperstown Crier has become kind of a regular in that little association as well.
Mm-hmm, yep. Well, now that I've abandoned ship, I can't help take care of it anymore.
Well,
but I go out there every month or two.
And we still have Freddie.
That's right. Freddie Borowski. We'll get him on here sometime, Claire.
I'm looking forward to that. You've talked avidly about Freddie. Sounds like quite a guy.
Yeah, Freddie was, let's see, he ran that research desk for about a dozen years, I think. We used to think of ourselves as superheroes. Batmensch and the Goy Wonder, we called ourselves.
Sounds about right. Anybody who walks into the Hall of Fame library for a decade was first greeted by Freddie at the desk.
Absolutely.
He was
and he was
such
great.
Such a consistent presence there. And, the hard part for me when I was in the Hall of Fame library was getting my work done because I was surrounded by all these people I liked and knew and always wanted to have conversations with the people I met in the library instead of do what I was there to do.
And that has always been the case with the library, and that has always been one of the best things about the Hall of Fame library. It was like a crossroads for all kinds of baseball research and historians, and I met many people just across the desk. For instance, 1991 I was there, and I was looking at something, and I saw something interesting about Paul Wainer. And I just got the attention of the guy across the table from me and pointed that out, and he nodded and smiled, and he said, you have a good eye. And we went back to it was Bob Davids, the founder of Sabre.
Yeah, my glove.
That's how I met him. You just never knew who would be there.
Never knew
when you were.
Norman Mock, Morris Eckhouse, all those guys. I remember my first encounter with Norman Mock. I wasn't sure if he was a human being or a ghost when I first met him. It was a very cosmic experience that I had with him.
Yeah. There's one other story that we have so many to get to. Charlie, we'll probably do this again, but I want you called me yesterday to tell me about a wild experience you recently had down in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, regarding a guy we have a mutual interest in, Christy Mathewson. In my Victory House book, I wrote quite a bit about Mathewson, and a great moment for me came about 20 years ago in San Francisco. I saw a performance of Eddie Frierson's one-man show on Christy Mathewson, which Eddie has been doing for 20 or 30 years now. And I was fortunate enough to see it. And one of the highlights of the show is his impression of Victory Faust doing his tryout for the Giants. And it's fantastic. And Charlie, you just saw it. Tell us about it.
Yeah.
Tell us how it came about.
Yeah, I was aware of that play for as long as it's been in existence. I clipped the review out of the New York Times way back in 1996 when he was doing it on Broadway, and I always wanted to see it. And fortunately, I just was able to for the first time just this past weekend. But yeah, I'm getting ahead of the story because this is another story that begins at the cemetery. And the cemetery in Lewisburg, which is basically on the campus of Bucknell College, Bucknell University, where Maddie went to school. And back in August, I went to the Little League World Series, and on my way to the games, I was staying at a town called Selinsgrove, which is further out from Lewisburg, but the rooms get cheaper the further away you get from Williamsport during the Little League World Series. So I was at some Airbnb out there, and on my way in on the Sunday of the championship game, I had a little extra time on my hands, and I thought, I'll stop in and see how Maddie's doing. I haven't been to his grave in 10 years. So I stopped in at the cemetery, and people leave baseballs and bats and different things on the grave site there. And I didn't have a whole lot with me to leave, but I decided I'd write him a note. And I just pulled out a piece of paper, which turned out to be a business card in my wallet, and wrote a little note to Maddie, letting him know that I was there and what day it was, and that it was the day of the championship game at the Little League World Series. Well, a few days later, I got an email from someone I didn't know. And it was a retired professor at Bucknell who walks around in the cemetery like we do. And he tends to Maddie's grave, much the way I tend to Emmett Ashford's in Cooperstown. He picks the weeds and makes sure it's all clean and looking good. And he saw my note, so he thought he should acknowledge that. And he wrote me an email telling me so. And I said, well, let's stay in touch now that we know each other. And sure enough, about a month or two later, I got another call from a friend of his inviting me to the show. He said that they're doing a special performance on the campus, which, you could have seen that show anywhere from coast to coast, but I think seeing it on the Bucknell campus adds a little poignancy to the whole thing. That's where he is buried and where he met his wife and where he went to school. And so I couldn't turn down that invitation. I tend bar here in Baltimore on the weekends, and I skipped out of my shift and probably lost a little money, but it was definitely worth it going up on that journey because I got to meet Eddie Frierson and see the show and some other people who were integral to the whole story. One is a woman named Betty Cook, who was Mathewson's wife's best friend. Mathewson's wife, Jane, befriended Betty Cook when she was a teenager, and they were 50 years apart in age, but they were still best pals. And when Maddie died, she would take Betty with her every year to the Hall of Fame for the induction ceremony, and she was treated as family up there. And she is still regarded as family. In fact, the Hall of Fame waived the family exemption, or the opposite of which, to include her to be invited every year, even after Jane was gone. They said, well, we can't leave Betty out. And they said, well, she's not really family. And they said, well, no, she really is. And so she continued to go and represent Maddie just up until recently. She's 90 years old, so she doesn't do it anymore. But it was fascinating sitting with her and hearing the stories that she had to tell. I interviewed her for 2 hours on a Monday morning, the day after the play, and I was invited to her house for the reception after the play was over on Sunday. Some people spent all the way until midnight there. I had to go home. I went home around 8 o'clock to go eat dinner back to my Airbnb, but people were staying at her house all the way till midnight. One of them was Babe Ruth's granddaughter, Linda Ruth Tassetti. So it tells you the kind of convergence of people that took place over the weekend there.
Amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a pretty neat story. and it's not over by any stretch.
I sure hope I get to see Eddie perform that again. It's really an extraordinary performance.
he will continue, but I don't know for how much longer. He's concerned with the fact that as he ages, he's not going to look so much like Matty anymore. I mean, I would imagine there's ways of adjusting the performance into more of a retrospect memoir. When you see him do it now, it's broken into two parts, and the first part is very much Matty in the moment, Matty talking to you from the time when he was still playing, and then there's after the intermission, he's in street clothes and doing a little bit more reminiscing, but obviously it's all delivered in the limited time which he had to live. Matty didn't live that long. I think he was 53 when he died.
No, he was 45.
Or even younger. 45. I'm sorry. 45. I was getting confused with the babe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Eddie's problem. He has no idea what an old Mathewson should look like.
Yeah.
But it's a very physically active part, especially the Victory Faust part, because he literally goes sliding around the bases on a theater stage, a hardwood stage.
Oh, yeah. And he was winding up and pitching when he was Matty. And Eddie is an old ball player and continues to still play some type of ball. He's in shape. You know, I met him, and he still has an athlete's build for a guy his age, which says something. I think he's probably in his early 60s, I'm guessing. But but he did tell me that.
Right, I think, yeah.
Yeah, he did tell me eventually he thinks he's going to age out of the role.
Well, that would be a shame.
Well,
but I understand that, especially if it does take that degree of athleticism.
Yeah, well, there's a few people.
He can always rewrite it.
Yeah, he can, and he had already made some adjustments to it. It was brought up to date in some ways. There was a reference and a side reference to the 2016 Cubs finally winning a World Series, which was delivered in the form of a joke. So there, obviously, there's modifications that are being made. Yeah, which I thought that was obviously something new. Now he channels other people too. His portrayal of McGraw is the three main characters in the play are Mathewson, McGraw, and Victory Faust, and there's some other characters too. But when he's channeling McGraw, he works himself up into a furor, yelling at umpires and players and running through the crowd. There's some audience participation where he's kind of yelling at members, the people who are in the theater, as if they were on the bench or in the clubhouse of the old Giants, and confronting people as if they were players on the team. So it's and he's visibly sweating when he's doing this stuff. You can see it.
Yeah, he and I have discussed that because when the whole point of my discussion of Faust was that his innocent good nature and gullibility acted as a counterbalance to McGraw's harshness and McGraw haranguing the players. And Eddie really brings that out on the show, that contrast.
The McGraw is such a fascinating character because, indeed, he's as cantankerous as they come, but he seemed to be drawn to people who had the opposite demeanor, Mathewson included. His favorite players were the more gentlemanly and gentle guys. Ross Youngs was one of his favorite players. Mathewson was one of his favorite players. And then he let this guy, Faust, who I don't even know if it's safe to call him a player. He was just a man on the street who somehow found himself affiliated with the club and, had McGraw's blessing for all of this,
more or less, yeah.
But again,
he was at least sanctioned, yeah.
Gabe, a lot of that was driven by the fact that McGraw was a very superstitious man, and that in that day and age, and especially with baseball, it's the fact that really superstition wasn't ridiculed, that
absolutely one of the strange one strange superstition of the time was that if you saw something like a horse and wagon with barrels on it, it was a sign of good luck. And so McGraw hired such a contraption and had them cross the paths of the ball players as they rode to the ballpark every morning on the road somewhere, just to make them think they were going to be lucky that day.
Well, yeah.
So
there's all sorts of, yeah. Well, and then Faust shows up and, wants to be, I don't know if you would call him a mascot. How would you, what would you refer to him as, a mascot or a honorary member of the team?
Human mascots were very common back then. And, he wouldn't have considered himself a mascot, but that is what he was. And he was the star of the pregame show. He'd pitch some batting practice. When he got some notoriety, Hannes Wagner even allowed Faust to strike him out in batting practice. It was like some grand joke that everybody was in on except Faust, who believed he was destined to pitch the Giants to the championship.
And all the
so everybody
while
had their fun at his expense. Everybody had their fun at Faust's expense, but while he was doing his thing, they went 36-3. That's just so far askew from any baseball outcome. 36-3 until they clinched the pennant.
Yeah, they rattled off a winning streak of 14 or 15 games right when he showed up. And, I guess that's why McGraw let him tag along because, they were still winning.
Exactly. And in 1912, he was with them, and they had the greatest start just about in Major League history. They went 54-11. And then they got wary of him, and for a number of reasons, and ran him off to Kansas, and they barely held on to win the pennant. It was that marked a difference. Rube Marquard set the record in 1912 by winning 19 games in a row to start the season. He was 19-0 when Faust left the team. In the next week, he lost 3 games.
Whoa.
Well, there you go.
Indeed.
In 1979, he told John Hallway, the historian, sitting on the veranda of the Otesaga in Cooperstown, John Hallway asked Marquard about Victory Faust, and Marquard just said, when he was with us, we won. When he wasn't, we didn't.
Yep.
It's that simple.
That's simple.
Amazing story.
Absolutely. Oh, guys, this has been great. I hate to say I probably got to give the maybe 3-minute warning. So if there's an opportunity for one more reflection, maybe Charlie, it's obvious. Your passion for the game and its history is obvious. But, somebody like me meeting you for the first time, and I'd say, why have you devoted such time and such passion to this game? How has it enriched your life for the better? What would your answer be?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking that, because I think I need to remind myself every now and then why I do it. And I do think it's for moments like this that we're having now, and the phone call I had with Gabe yesterday. The game has provided so many opportunities to meet people and foster relationships and friendships. And when I came back from seeing the play and Victory Faust figuring so prominently in it, I hadn't talked to Gabe in a while. And we were talking about Gabe when I was out there with Eddie, and I have a copy of the book about Victory Faust here at home. And as soon as I got home from that trip, I said, well, I guess I got to give Gabe a call. And so those are the reasons why I remain to be so passionate about it and drawn to it, is because of the wonderful baseball community. With Ralph Tycho, we're talking about his ears hopefully are burning somewhere. We mentioned him before, but all the people that you meet, and I think Gabe might reiterate that.
So
absolutely. Yeah, baseball is about connections, and the more time you spend around the game and with it and with the people who are equally fascinated about it, what Charlie said is absolutely right. It's the connections we make, the past, the present, wherever we go. Baseball is a bond that can lead to greater friendships.
Amen. I don't think I can add anything to that except to say, Charlie Vascellero, thank you for joining us on Claire's Corner. And Gabriel Schecter, my esteemed co-host, thank you for bringing Charlie onto the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. And remember, all our programs along of Claire's Corner, and I think we're approaching thousands now, a couple of thousand shows in the Comfortably Zoned Radio Archives, an eternal listening delight. So until next time, happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.